Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial's One Belonging series, where we explore the experiences of individuals from the BAME community. And this week, it's a pleasure to have Panyo Mulongeni with us. Panyo, it's so good that you're with us. I know you're a research assistant at Imperial College. I really want to get into, your story. So Panyo, can you give us a little bit of a sense of what it is that gives you your sense of belonging, your sense of identity?
Thank you so much. I think my sense of belonging definitely comes from my lineage, and there are different lineages that interweave. So I have my actual genealogical lineage, which is Bulgarian and Namibian.
Right.
And that is one sense of belonging. And then the other set of belonging is my lineage in the line of people who have been part of the gay community, transgender community over the centuries. And there's so many people to mention, but just to highlight a few, such as James Baldwin, Marcel Proust, the late choreographer Alvin Ailey. So that lineage as well is one that I'm part of. So those are the two main interweaving.
So give me a sense then, thank you for that. Tell me a little bit about how those lineages, well, let's start off with your biological lineage and how that, because that came before the second lineages, if you get what I mean. And there's that whole process of going from understanding who you are from that perspective. So can you give me a sense of growing up? What was it that gave you that sense of belonging, that sense of identity?
Well, just to say, I'm not actually sure that necessarily my identity as a queer person came before, because I think from my earliest memories, when I was in Bulgaria, so I was born in socialist Bulgaria, and this was in 1986. Behind me, I have actually a collage that I made some years ago. So I'll just bring it up and I'll show you a picture of my dad. So this is a very happy father. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah,
there he is, yeah, black and white. 1986 in the hospital. And he was a refugee in Bulgaria as a student. And I think one of my earliest memories was I was at the kindergarten and there was this boy who wanted to fight with me. I can't remember exactly why. There was this boy who wanted to fight with me, but I decided actually to not fight with him. I actually felt I didn't understand why he wanted to fight with me. So I wanted to actually just be like close to him. And I think that's already an awareness of this queer sensibility. So when I was 5, we moved because Namibia did not exist when I was born. And I guess you can show the map so that I can just briefly explain. What actually happened was that Namibia from 1915 was captured by South Africa. So Namibia was a German colony in Africa. As you know, most of Africa was colonized, and Namibia was captured by South Africa. There you see Namibia in the green, and it stayed as part of South Africa because the British said, well, it's too far away for us. We have our Dominion of South Africa. Just take care of it for us, will you? Instead of being prepared for independence, we know that didn't happen to any of these former German colonies, and World War II broke out. And after World War II, South Africa was taken control over by the Nationalist Party, which was very right-wing and actually quite sympathetic towards the Nazis, even though they were British Dominion. And they cut ties off with the Commonwealth, and they said, we'd rather just be on our own, thank you very much, and set up our own state, which elevated white people. As you know, it was a white supremacist state that we know as apartheid South Africa. So Namibia followed with that. And my father was born in that time in 1954. And in 1950s, there was a lot of campaigning for Namibia to become independent diplomatically, but that didn't really work out well because the International Court of Justice said, well, we don't have jurisdiction, they first said. And then finally in 1966, they said, okay, we do have jurisdiction. And what South Africa is doing is illegal. They should leave this territory known as Southwest Africa at the time. But they didn't. And so the armed struggle began. My father joined the armed struggle in the late 1970s, and he walked from Namibia to the country above. I don't know if you can see in the map, Angola. And then from Angola, he went to Zambia, and he was fortunate enough to then get a scholarship through this socialist solidarity to study in Bulgaria. And he met my mother there. So there's Bulgaria on the map. It's very, very small. And I know a lot of people will actually remember this talk as, oh, I heard this person speak. He's from Namibia and Belgium. And it's happened to me so many times. That's why I put the map of Bulgaria there, because Belgium, we know Belgium, it's a well-known country, starts with a B, also small in Europe. And it is a running joke for me, because even when I was flying to the UK last year, this is a year actually coincidentally since I flew to the UK from Namibia. At the border, I almost didn't make it on the plane because in Ethiopia, they saw my Bulgarian ID and they looked at me and they looked at the ID, and then I saw my Namibian passport, which had a slightly different name called Pancho, and that's because my name has two different versions in Bulgarian. But the one version ended up in my Namibian passport. He said, no, I mean, what is this? Is this a British residence permit? And I said, no, I'm Bulgarian. I'm an EU citizen. And luckily, there was someone there from the British High Commission or British Embassy. And this was a lady of African descent. And she looked at me and she said, oh, okay, well, you're not in the EU now, so you can't really fly with this ID, but I'll let you fly with the ID just for now. And I said, thank you so much. And then I said, is there anything else I have to do when I get to Heathrow? She says, yeah, just make sure you explain to them you are from Belgium. I said, no, I mean, I'm from Bulgaria. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry. So that's why I put it on. That's why I put it on the map. Bulgaria had a lot of solidarity, and I was very fortunate that my family actually was the first Bulgarian families, we can say, in Namibia, since Namibia only gained independence in 1990, and I arrived in 1991.
Right.
So we had a little bit of a Bulgarian enclave, because my father, having spoken Bulgarian for 12 years in Bulgaria, I mean, in socialism, it wasn't an English-speaking country. It's still not an English-speaking country, but you can imagine under the Iron Curtain, behind the Iron Curtain, how many people spoke English. So he spoke Bulgarian fluently, and so he continued to speak Bulgarian in our household. And so we grew up really as a Bulgarian family, but at the expense of me learning my father's language.
Yeah.
So it was wonderful, but I realized, yes, I missed out a little on that. And as an adult, later on, I started learning the language on my own accord.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So you've got rich ties to Bulgaria, but you only spent a few years in Bulgaria. How long were you in Namibia before coming?
That's so true. I only spent 5 years in Bulgaria, but they were really very formative years. And I think that's the narrative that my grandparents especially pushed, that, I sort of was raised in Bulgaria. And there's also this urban legend, or it's actually a Bulgarian folk belief, that if you where the umbilical cord of the baby is thrown, so the umbilical cord of a neonate eventually falls off. So wherever you throw that, that's where the person will be tied to and tethered to.
Right.
And so I'm tethered to Bulgaria. I spent 5 years there, and then I moved to Namibia. And at the age of, I guess, 17 is when I left again. and I would visit Bulgaria. We'd visit Bulgaria every 5 years or so.
Yeah.
But I really spent most of my childhood and adolescence in Namibia. But in my sort of old adolescence, that's when I left, because there was actually a Welsh teacher of mine. So I was very fortunate that my parents, both having had advanced education from Bulgaria, both holding PhD degrees, had very good jobs in Namibia. And so they sent me to a very good Catholic private school.
Right.
And I had a Welsh teacher, and she said, well, there's a scholarship to study in Italy when they're looking for a Namibian boy, because I don't know if you can point out Sierra Leone on the map, Wayne. There was a boy from Sierra Leone who couldn't get the scholarship. So this school in Italy brings together people from all over the world. Yeah, Sierra Leone. And they couldn't, the Sierra Leone boy who could not get the scholarship. So they just chose Namibia, which was only 13 years old then as a country. And I applied and I got it. And so I went to Italy, the very northeastern part of Italy, to a school known as the United World College. Yeah, that's exactly where it is. It's actually on the border between Italy and Slovenia. So really where that line is. And I represented Namibia, but then I also ended up representing Bulgaria at this school. And it's a school that brings together young people from all over the world to study for 2 years. Yeah. And you, in a sense, you foster an international understanding through not only education, but also activities that you do there, and you make presentations about your country. So I did a presentation about 14 years of Namibian independence, 10 years after apartheid in South Africa. I did that together with the South African student to speak about how much has changed, what hasn't changed. And shortly thereafter, after I finished high school there, I also followed the advice of a friend who I had met in Namibia actually at the Catholic Church. He said, well, if you're going to this school, which is a network of, then it was 12 schools called United World Colleges, and now there are 18 of them. He told me this network is very prestigious. It started in Wales. So the first school is actually here in the UK in Wales. And he said there's an international patron in the US called Shelby Davis. And if you apply to these schools in the US, he will pay for you. And I said, really? So I had that in my mind when I was 17. I should apply to the US, but I really wanted to do Oxford. Right. So it was my dream to do Oxford. So I applied to Oxford. I got in, but I didn't get any funding. And then I applied to a number of schools in the US and I got in. And of course, I had the funding because of this philanthropist. So I ended up going to Princeton instead of Oxford. And 4 years later was the world economic crash of 2009, which we all remember. Yeah. And I came back to Namibia because there was no way I could stay in the US really. Yeah. To find a job there. And it was really very empowering. So I worked in Namibia then for about a few years. And I really felt very empowered to work in public health. So I had done epidemiology as an undergrad. And then I had really the very good fortune of stumbling upon a job with alumnus who actually went to Princeton. He was a consultant there. And I don't know if that played a hand in me getting the job as a research assistant when I was there, but I did get a job at this amazing public health organization in Namibia. And from there, I really managed to springboard and learn a lot of skills. And I ended up doing my master's fully funded at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And so, yeah, just to show I think I've been very, very fortunate. I finished that master's in 2016 and I presented on HIV among gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men in South Africa. I did that at the AIDS conference in Durban. Thereafter, I went back to Namibia. I spent about a year in Namibia before starting a PhD in Australia. And by this time, I had already studied in South Africa, Italy, and the US, and I thought it would just be the same. Little did I know the PhD experience would be really much different, especially in terms of what the expectation was. And I think for me, the expectation was that I would really just go along with the flow. But in reality, I had to really create my own project, and I had a lot of difficulty doing that, especially finding my niche within the larger project that the supervisor had chosen. And I had to leave that supervisor, and I couldn't find another one. And this was just when COVID was starting. So I had a choice of either staying in Australia without any funding because my project was tied to my supervisor, or leaving and seeing what else I could do. And there was this thing called COVID, which has just started in China. And I thought, this has already come to Australia. If you remember, Australia was one of the first countries to have COVID in the West. And I thought, I'd rather leave, because even while I'm waiting for a new supervisor and searching for funding, I have to sustain myself, and Australia is already closing down. So I said I'll leave, and I left the program, and I went to back to Namibia, but not before I stopped in Hong Kong, where I actually started interviewing people, well, not on the street, but people at the Hong Kong Department of Health, to find out about this new virus, because I was really interested as an epidemiologist. And then when I went back to Namibia, I did a lot of health writing on COVID. I started a podcast on COVID. And finally, when I found out about my EU rights, and I saw this thing about the UK and Brexit, and I had like a moment, a few months, that was last year, 2020, before I could enter the UK and work. And I said, well, you know what? Why don't I do this? I am EU after all. And I applied to work at Public Health England, and I was very fortunate again that the person on my panel, I don't know if I should say this, but it is the truth, the person on our panel was also from Southern Africa. And I wonder whether it is that type of identification that we see in each other. And of course, I did have the competencies for the post, but perhaps he did see something that he resonated with, and he really helped me when I got the position. I wasn't the only one on the panel, but he was really very understanding that I had to fly within a week. Yeah. And I had to sort of find accommodation and everything, and it all worked out. So then after I finished that, I applied to Imperial. And once again, I was very fortunate, because the person's group who I'm working with at Imperial, herself, she had started a PhD, and her PhD lost funding, and then she applied to a research assistantship at Imperial, and she got it here where I am at the St. Mary's campus. And it was that research assistantship that allowed her to start a new PhD and made her into the researcher that she is today. Her name is Professor Azragani, and she was knighted by the Queen earlier this year. So again, I was very fortunate that, I've encountered people who've really been very supportive, and this is where I am today, working at Imperial on a malaria vaccine project. As you know, the WHO approved this week the use of a malaria vaccine, and what our group is doing is actually seeing how feasible this vaccine would be by modeling the use of the vaccine in combination with other interventions. And yeah, it has been a journey, and it's one that I didn't really plan or think I would end up here.
You're telling me it's a journey. I was just trying to note down all of the different countries. So Namibia, Bulgaria, the US, Italy, Australia. You're a global citizen. I suppose that what interests me, all of it interests me, but that scholarships that you won when you were 17 to go to that international school, that kind of like set you up. You could say from before that, from when you made the transition from Bulgaria to Namibia, but then having the opportunity again at age 17, a very formative age, to be in the presence of such a multicultural environment. How would you say that helped to inform your identity and what you could do and what your prospects were?
I really agree with you. I think Definitely, the school that I went to wasn't really so much an international one. I mean,
Okay.
it was called United World College, but when we hear international school, we think of expats and sending their kids and paying these hefty fees. Where I went, everyone was on scholarship, but it did set me up absolutely at that United World College. But I agree with you, um, the absolute whole. Notion of me as a sort of an African coming from a country that has very poor resources, very few resources, and just being lucky and going and getting this opportunity. In a sense, that's not really my story because, as you said, I already came from a Bulgarian family, a multicultural family, if you can call it that, or at least two cultures. And I already had a very strong educational background because I went to the best rated school in Namibia.
Yeah.
And that wasn't free. So in a sense, yes, I don't take it for granted what I have done. And also a part of me is coming to terms with who actually I am, because even though I fully identify as Namibian, I also fully identify as Bulgarian. But I know that I'm not the archetypal Namibian, definitely not the archetypal Bulgarian, because when I still meet Bulgarians here in London, a lot of them are flabbergasted I speak Bulgarian fluently. And even those who are not will say something like, well, oh, so it's your dad who's Bulgarian, right? As opposed to saying, oh, you're Bulgarian as well, and one of your parents. Because we're still, coming from a small country in Eastern Europe, which is not like Portugal or the UK, where you have so much migration. You've had so much migration and, colonialism that has melded populations that is, for many people, it's normal to see a person of color speaking their native language, like in Portugal. Still not normal in Bulgaria, unfortunately, whatever normal means. But I definitely do think I had an advantage being from a family that value education, especially my mom. My mom, I mean, she was not even a first generation educated to PhD level. My dad definitely was a first generation educated to PhD level in his family in Namibia, perhaps even to a university education. Although he had a grand uncle who was a Lutheran priest, so I'm sure he had some education. But my mom, her dad was a professor in Bulgaria of philosophy. So in a sense, I'm also trying to come to grips with who I am, because when I followed the other Belong series, Wayne, it was hard for me to even come today, because I thought, my goodness, I don't really have that story that I can say I was so, I had so little and I came from so little and look where I am now.
That's not the idea about belonging. The idea is to find out where it is, because you're coming from a different perspective. You're coming from two cultures and the acceptance within two cultures. And how is that? How do you, because for some people, they'll say that I didn't feel one culture was catering for my needs, or I wasn't accepted in that culture, etc. So you've got that, but in addition to that, from my understanding, is you've also got that. I don't know whether to say you've visited so many different cultures, as though almost like you're in search of something. What is it that you're searching for? Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's true. And my one of my family members actually told me, laughingly at me, because they're thinking you still want to do a PhD and you don't even know where you are. You don't have a house, don't have a family. So my family member actually said to me, "So who are you actually? You're so confused. You don't even know who you are." And I said, "Well, perhaps that is part of the beauty, that tension and feeling betwixt and betwined between two cultures, at least for the minimum." When I spent time in Italy, I learned the language, and I felt quite accepted by the Italian people who I met there. And of course, we know that Italy, of course, has issues with immigration and race, and there's sort of a reckoning that they have to deal with now with a lot of the migrants, and Bulgaria as well. Unfortunately, you know, we've seen a rise in nationalism in Europe all over, and Bulgaria hasn't been spared by that. So to come back, you said the acceptance in two. Yes, I feel I have been accepted in both, but also I am aware that even even though I'm accepted in both, it's almost as if I don't really fit in fully in both. And I'm still seen as a little different. My grandmother, though, my late grandmother, really went to great lengths to make sure that I felt Bulgarian. I mean, she taught me how to read and write the language, and she would compare me to Pushkin. And I'm not sure if many of the listeners know who Pushkin was. So Pushkin was a Russian aristocrat who lived in the 18th century, and he actually was of African descent. He had an African grandfather who was stolen from what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo and taken to the court of the Russian Tsar, Peter the Great. So my grandmother would compare me to him, but when recently I researched who Pushkin was after her passing, and yes, he did amazing things. I mean, he is credited to have inventing modern Russian because he was an author and he wrote so much. He modernized the Russian language, which is quite ironic for a country like Russia, which has had issues of racism and nationalism in the past, but the language, you know, is sort of been molded by someone of African descent. But when you look at his history, it's not a really pleasant one because his grandfather was sort of stolen, not sort of stolen. So grandfather wasn't a slave, but completely deracinated from his African culture. And I think part of my family did that a little in the sense of by making us so Bulgarian. It was in a sense looking at the Namibian side as something that is there, but not really something that I needed to investigate because I am Bulgarian. So it doesn't really matter if I don't speak my father's language. I know my mother tongue, right? It's my mother's language. And that in a sense is a bit concerning. And even if we don't know Bulgaria as a colonial power, if you look in the Balkans, the history of the Balkans, Bulgaria did invade other countries in the Balkans historically. So in a sense, Bulgaria also has that nationalist sort of supremacist streak, and doesn't make it much different to Italy or France or, you know, all of those countries, even though they claim, you know, that they're different from Western Europe. So it's a sense that, you know, you have to be, I'm aware now that even my own family history is not without sort of these lines of nationalism, which are just the other side of racism, right? And how do I deal with that is a question.
One of the things which I agree, one of the things which kind of like pops in my head as you were speaking was the extent of a lot of what you've said has been about your coming to terms, or not your coming to terms, your interaction with your Bulgarian side of the family. What was your father's side? What was the father's influence on you? It would be
you can see how telling that is, even in the way I'm speaking. I've spoken a lot about Bulgaria. So you can see to the extent to which I've been, how my upbringing was. And I think this is one of the issues. So my father never contested. For him, it was never, and he's still alive, both my parents are still alive, he never wanted me to sort of think of myself as less Bulgarian than I am, or to say, well, you should really now start learning my language, or, you know, this is what we do. This is what it means to be Oshiwambo, because my father's language group is actually called they are Ovawambo people. So my father's influence, I think, was really very important because the whole Bulgarian side for me does become a bit overwhelming if I have to think about this language, and I have to now know the language really well, and there these identities, and how do I fit in there, and there's racism and all these things. When I'm in Namibia, I don't really feel that, and I'm fortunate I haven't really experienced racism in Namibia, although we know that there is, because Namibia also is a post-colonial society like South Africa with the diverse groups. My father's side, I think, really, if I have to just summarize it, it's really an influence that allows me to sort of ground myself and feel very, very actually, how can I say, connected to things that matter. So the Bulgarian side, I guess, is quite Southeastern European, like obsessed with what's happening in your life. Like, what did you eat? What did you do? Are you safe? Whereas for him, he's very relaxed and not all about that. And even with food, he won't be obsessed with like, well, we have to have all these different foods and make all these recipes. Like, well, as long as we have food, that's fine. We don't have to worship the cult of food. Whereas, the Bulgarian side is like, we make the best dishes. Bulgarian food is the best. And I think part of me also appreciates that with my father's side, I could go and visit him in his family in the north of Namibia and just understand the different notions of family, which is beyond the nuclear family. As I mentioned, my father's great grand uncle, which is my late grandmother's uncle, he had an influence in my grandmother's life because he was her uncle. And traditionally in Namibia, a man's obligations are to his sister's children because it's a matrilineal society.
Right, okay.
So those are his sort of children, his sister's children, because it's your matrilineal line that counts. That has changed now, obviously, due to westernization, and you live in a 21st century legal system where family is really very nuclear defined in terms of your obligations. But that was something that I could appreciate. And I think I don't want to sound very trite or quaint. I won't say I appreciate the simpler things, but I actually want to say appreciate people in a different way that's outside of these notions of constraints of time, because everything is so time bound where we are. Whereas there, you really spend a long time connecting with people. Even the way of greeting in my father's language is very elaborate. You have to, greet for at least a couple of sentences. That's a joke that you spend a long time greeting, and you finally get to the place where thing you want to address. Whereas I guess here in the West, and even in Bulgaria, I think you just say what you need from someone. You don't need to greet them, and so it's been an important counterpoint. But of course, it is a bit of a loss for me that only as an adult I really found out I had been missing out a lot on that Namibian side, the Oshuambo side. And I mean, I can still connect with it, I guess, virtually through what's available online, but it's a very small community, relative to other African communities, the Wambo Nation. And I also want to understand what it means to be Namibian, because Namibia is a new country, and we've had, in the past, we had apartheid, we had ethnic division. So we're also trying to understand what it means to be Namibian beyond ethnicity.
Yeah.
But my father's still an influence for me today. He was a journalist for many years, and when I started the podcast, I got his advice.
Yeah.
So we're still very close.
I'm just wary of time. Time has gone from us.
Oh yes, it has. Yeah.
Don't worry. You have such a fascinating story. I don't know why you said that you didn't know why you should be here. You definitely should, because the intricacies and I love the way that you've actually unpacked your history and how that's helped you to define who you are. Because without that prior knowledge, sometimes we just get a superficial understanding, but without actually knowing what are the tides that bind us. And I think you've done really well in articulating both the Namibian side and the Bulgarian side, and how all of those link together in helping to form who you are, if that makes sense. And I know that there's the other side, which we haven't really touched on, and that's kind of like of course, you gave us two lineages at the start, the biological and the queer identity, and we haven't really touched that. How is that perceived in Namibia? We're gonna have to do that, and then I'm gonna have to open it up to the audience. But
maybe I'll give the classic Naomi Campbell answer. When they asked her what she thought of a controversial topic, she just said, "Next question," because
okay.
Because I think to unpack that, I would need a whole other belonging, and
Okay.
I think that answers it briefly. Yeah.
Okay. What we'll have to arrange another time. That's what you're saying. We're gonna have to bring you back for part two, which I'm more than happy to do, because I think that is something that we should also investigate and get to understand.
If I had to say it briefly, I think what we miss as people who are, especially people of African descent, is a lot of us think, oh, we just need to accept LGBT people, and if you don't accept it, it's like you're ignorant and everything. I think that's missing something, and I think the one thing that it's missing is that people who if you've had generations of understanding of what humanity is, and you've had colonialism, and especially these Victorian sodomy laws in all these countries, that including Namibia, these colonial hangovers, you can't expect people just to shift their thinking overnight. And I think another problem that we have is especially as queer people, is if you are a queer person of, let's say, African descent, you have that lineage of, you're queer, but you also have the lineage of being a person of African descent, and the racism that your ancestors have faced, whether on the African continent or in Australia or the UK. And you sometimes bring these together, and people around you will be like, wait a minute, you can't necessarily just say it's the same thing, being queer and being Black in Britain, or it's not the same thing. You don't mix the two things. And I think to be said about that is, well, to an extent, yes, it's not the same, and we can't just say the history of civil rights and freedom had queer people in mind. Sometimes it didn't have the queer people in mind, it didn't really. And other times, like in South Africa, queer people played a role. So I think it's that intertwining that is difficult, and to recognize the difference, as you said, in the histories, and to see, well, how can we now, in where we are, still recognize the importance of what it means to be queer for people especially people of African descent.
I still think we're going to thank you for that answer, but I still think we're probably going to need to delve into that a little more. I'm just wondering if there are any questions, if we've got one or two questions from the audience with regards to your story.
Let's see.
We've got one from William.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating talk. Yeah, and like you say, Wayne, it's a very rich story. So yeah, so there's no need to be like almost apologetic that it doesn't sound like other stories. Each story is its own story, isn't it? Yeah. I just wanted to just to reflect on how you think your journeys of identity have impacted your career choices. Were they the career choices that you would have chosen, or is it that because of your experiences, you're traveling and moving, that has somehow influenced what you've ended up doing and will do in the future?
Yeah, I definitely think it's both. So my career choice right now, there's still a question mark. What is my career choice? So I'm doing academia right now. I'm a research assistant. I definitely come from that line. As I said, my grandfather was a philosophy professor in Bulgaria, and as an early career researcher, if I call myself that, I do draw on my experiences, especially, you know, being Namibian and having the AIDS pandemic sweep through our country. That exposure from an early age made me want to pursue something. First, I thought in basic science, but then I realized, well, basic science is not really for me. And being aware of the toll that actually AIDS took on the gay and bisexual community, that really led me to the topic of HIV and the epidemic and the epidemiology. So it led me to mathematical modeling, which is what I'm doing now. So it was a bit of both, but I cannot discount the huge influence that my grandfather had, who was a philosophy professor. Yeah.
Thanks, William, for that story. Are there any other questions? What? I shouldn't jump in, but I'm going to jump in. What advice then would you give to somebody? What advice would you have given to your 17-year-old self when you got that scholarship? What would you have told them? What would you tell them in hindsight about how you would develop, or what? Yeah, what advice would you give?
That's so difficult. I think what I would tell them is there is very little that you can choose. So of those things that you can choose, don't worry too much about it, because yeah, that's what I would say, that you know, you have the power of choice, and in a sense your path is not predetermined. But even if you choose something and you think it's not the right choice, there is no real right choice, because your life, in a sense, if we think of philosophically, you can think of it as something that is unfolding with each choice rather than predestined. So I'd say don't worry too much about these choices, because you don't know what the next step will be and when you can make another choice to shift it.
Fantastic. That is very philosophical. That is, our destiny is controlled, but it isn't controlled. There's always another choice which can help you navigate where you currently are. So I like that. I do like that. Panyo, I just want to say a big thank you for your time that we've been able to share this afternoon. I do think we're going to have to arrange to have another one, because I think there's some nuances which we haven't yet unpacked and uncovered. So be prepared for the invite, okay? And it was a real pleasure to have you on with us this afternoon. So I'm going to just share what's coming up next. For next week, we're going to have Faith Ruto, who is an executive coach, a keynote speaker, and the author of Transform Within. And so she's going to be our guest next week to share her story. And if you haven't been able to see any of these interviews before, then please go to our YouTube site where you can see other interviews which we've done in the series. So if you go to tinyurl.com/belonging-IAO, then you'll see this and other interviews. Thanks everyone for joining us again this week, and look forward to seeing you again next week. So
thank you so much, Wayne.
You're quite welcome. It's brilliant having you on.